Hello, and welcome to Two Pews in a Pod. Join us as we explore faith in a modern world at Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Now, here is your host, Pastor Paul Baglios.
I am Vicar Megan Wyant, Director of Youth and Family Ministries at Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland.
I'm Daniel Catalano, the Director of Music Ministries here at Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland.
And I'm Paul Baglios, serving as pastor of Evangelical Lutheran Church. And today we are joined by a wonderful guest, Robert Hahn. Bob is a member of this congregation, and Bob also chairs the candidacy committee of the Delaware, Maryland Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Candidacy is the word we use in our denomination for the process of accompanying, evaluating, guiding, and discerning with people preparing for public ministry leadership in the church. In our candidacy process, there are three major milestone occasions. The first is when someone applies and then meets with the candidacy committee for an entrance decision. If the committee discerns in the person, at least in potential, the necessary gifts, aptitudes, readiness to begin preparing, to begin to enter formation for ministry, and then later meeting again with the committee for a decision that we call endorsement, which means endorsing their continuation in theological study and in formation for ministry leadership toward the completion of their programs. And the final point is to meet with the committee for an approval decision. And that means being approved for call and ordination. And Bob, we are so happy that you are joining us today. This is the fourth episode of 4 in our series on formation for ministry leadership. And broadly, the topic for this episode has to do with the transition from seminary to parish, from student to ministry leader. So welcome. We're happy to have you here. We will invite you to say whatever is most urgently on your mind in this podcast. But as we discussed a few minutes ago while we were sitting down, perhaps you would want to, thinking especially about when you and the committee with which you serve meets with people, especially for that approval decision, as you will soon be meeting with Megan Wyant. What do you look for, listen for? What do you hear and see that is encouraging? And what do you hear or see that might be more concerning? If you like that question, feel free to answer it. If you hate it, you may ignore it and say whatever you want. The microphone is yours.
Well, that's a tall order, Paul. That's a tall order. First of all, I think it's important to understand that the committee is formed of 12 or plus individuals throughout the synod, and so the ideas and the what people are looking for is going to be dependent on that group of people that are sitting down and discussing with the candidate where they are in the process. We're looking for different things depending on where people are. And we don't have a particular canned list of criteria per se, but we do want to make sure that as a candidate grows in the process, that they are indeed taking all the information that they've learned in seminary, taking all the information they've learned as part of their internship, taking the information that they've gotten through their clinical CPE portion of their study, and are looking for ways to use that in a leadership role when they enter the roster. The term is used is a rostered leader within the ELCA. And so depending on the roster you've chosen, you've decided to go down, that's going to sort of change the expectations from members of the committee. And, we sort of fall into a group of categories. We want to make sure that what people have learned in seminary, they've really gotten so that they can, I like to look at things and how do you explain that to someone else who didn't go to seminary?
Right. Yeah.
Where do you use that? We look at examples of preaching when people have, during their internship or whenever during their seminary or candidacy process, they've preached. How have they grown in that process of delivery, bringing the gospel message into the tech, whatever they're talking about for that particular week? All of those things are, an aspect of it. I personally like to focus in on the fact that you are entering the roster of a Lutheran minister, pastor, or deacon, and what is it about the Lutheran witness that is unique, and how do you describe that to people that don't necessarily know what that is?
Yeah.
That's a key.
Absolutely.
That's a key element, because one of the things we're finding is that the road through candidacy is very, very different these days, it appears, than the standard come out of college, go to seminary, be trained as a pastor, go through your candidacy committee, go to first call, boom, you're now a pastor or a deacon, deaconess. And we're getting a lot of different individuals coming from different faith groupings or whatever.
Have you found that in regards to the people coming in, what's known as like second career paths, so like they've done a career of some sort, have you found that is more prevalent, less prevalent? Are you seeing more of that? Like how would you sort of categorize that?
I would say recently, I've served on candidacy. This is my 7th year on the candidacy committee, so I can't speak for prior to that time. But in the time that I've served in this capacity, I do find that there's a great deal of a larger number of second career individuals
Or more.
or
Right,
more,
right.
multi-career, and a lot, and we've and a lot that have sort of come about the process of discernment in a very unique way. From not the traditional cradle. The term is cradle to grave Lutheran.
Right.
Many have come from a different faith tradition, and the key there is I think the term that's used often is formation, the Lutheran formation, and that becomes a piece of the education aspect of it. And seminaries have traditionally been served in that role and capacity, but the reality is, I would say, since COVID completely changed the educational dynamic
Yeah, I'm sure.
of theological education. The thing about the aspect of formation has been something that is a little more difficult to acquire, because I think the seminaries you got it as a sort of through osmosis, because everybody was on campus.
Yes.
You had opportunities to gather after a class and discuss what you just heard the professor say, and argue and kibitz about how that is really useful in today's congregational format and those kinds of things. And we're finding, to be honest, and we talk about it as a committee, the aspect of formation is an area that is changed because of the lack of that grouping and more of a distributed learning environment, which
Yes.
is fine for the educational aspect of theological education, but not so much if you're trying to sort of decompress with that. All right, these are great ideas. You can talk about it over Zoom, but you might not get the same level
Yes,
of
absolutely.
interaction that you might have gotten in a different environment.
And formation is often, I know with Church Divinity School of the Pacific, how they have their hybrid. I don't have my.
That's Episcopal,
I know, I was gonna-
right?
Yeah, that's right. But with that, formation is a hard thing to track as well, and
Yeah.
so
It's
that's
very
one
subjective.
thing, very subjective. And so for programs, either those who have moved to more of a hybrid plan, or like the seminary that I'm involved with, that have been hybrid for quite some time, that is still one of their major challenges. Not that formation does or doesn't occur, but then how does one articulate? Are you being formed? I mean, the short answer is yes. Every waking day you are formed in some way, but then there comes a point, as I can imagine with you and within the committee's position, there has to be some way of, okay, how do we track that?
And the major element of formation, as I think about it, and given the whole 30 seconds that I've had here to contemplate it, is that formation piece of it is how do you take what you've learned
Right.
and apply it to day-to-day ministry?
Yeah.
Because that's ultimately what you're walking into, is this day-to-day activity of church leadership. And that becomes a key difference in the role of a pastor or
Right.
minister of deaconess, and just a very involved layperson.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of individuals who are very active in their church, but they're not put in that role of rostered leader. And that is a big difference. And part of that understanding between those two things is part of what I would term in the formation aspect of what do you do in this situation as a pastor versus what you do in this situation as a really involved Christian lay individual.
Yes.
That's excellent, Bob. I'm curious to know if you have some of these thoughts near the tip of your tongue. How would you describe or articulate the difference between a very active member of the congregation who is in leadership? And here at ELC, I mean, we could start
List,
to name,
I know.
without even having to
Dozens.
pause or hesitate, dozens of people who lead this congregation magnificently. And although she's off camera, I think of our staff colleague, Marie, who is here on campus working for this congregation at least as often, as much as I am. I understand a difference, but I'm curious to know how you would articulate it, if you have an answer to that question.
Well, the thing that popped in my head is what I hear a number of people comment on in candidacy. It's one of those things, now that I'm actively involved in candidacy,
Right.
I listen for certain things. And I have found that when we transition somebody and endorse them into the process, so they've sort of gotten through educational aspect and are ready to move that next thing. One of the titles that's granted is vicar, but the big deal is the opportunity to wear the collar. And the power of the collar has been one of the things that I hear most commonly referred to as boy, I didn't realize when I walked into the room with my collar on how the environment of the room changed. Because people look to the person with the collar differently than they look towards the guy walking in with the suit, perhaps, very leadership oriented. But the one with the collar brings with it a lot of different gravitas, if you would.
Well, and I'll add, even if it's a figurative collar,
Right.
as the deacons of our church, ministers of word and service, who are ordained. They are clergy, but not usually dressed the way I am, for example.
Well, and the difference also could be, as I've heard some colleagues say, that when they, like the newly ordained priests or the deacons that would get ordained, going into certain circumstances could have either positive or negative.
Yeah.
So you're right
Yes,
that there is a, it's not nothing. That is a symbol of clerical pastoral leadership, and with often, as I'm sure all have experienced, the hurt that the church can have at times, that is, you look like that one priest who did X, or deacon that did blank. And so I think there's almost this reverence in the sense of being cautious or careful or attentive, I think, to that role and to that dress.
And the other piece of it is a big differentiator is the rostered leaders, the rostered roles within the organization. They have to be willing to speak truth to power differently than an individual who may just be very active. And often can be a challenge. That can be a challenge. You have to sort of be when you're a leader within the congregation, you sort of are a role model, cajoler, and sort of gatherer, and be able to speak truth in situations where people don't want to necessarily hear the truth in the way that they think.
Yes, exactly.
And how do you do that? And I believe that's another differentiator between the rostered individual and the non-rostered individual. And it doesn't mean that you're less active or less involved or less loving of your faith or anything like that. It's just, the rostered leader has to figure out, all right, what do we need to do? And then who needs to help me do it?
Yes.
And how do I get them to do that?
Right.
And they may then, delegate to other leaders within the organization, but part of their role is to sort of set the
Equip and empower, right?
Empower, right?
Yeah.
As you say, equip and empower. I want to give you a chance, Megan, to respond to what Bob is sharing with us. I know this stirs a lot of your own
Well, it does,
attention.
yeah. And when we talk about collars and dress, I mean, that is a big piece of the differentiation, right? Deacons can wear collars, but I also know that many deacons like entering spaces unawares and being a part, and that is a part of that, I think, specific call is the idea of embodying and coming from the people. One of my favorite things to do is like when we're in church and any role I have when I stand up from within the people. I always find that really interesting. But the other side being when you shifted into that, what we call pastoral authority, and your sense of who you are as a minister and how much attention you have to give to that formation and to developing your sense. And it goes back to our last segment where we talked a lot about you forming yourself and being self-aware and doing that work so that you can truly find your authentic sense of pastoral authority. So you don't just come bolstering into rooms like, do this, I'm the leader, rah, rah, rah. That's not what it is, right? You have to figure out who you are as a leader.
No, and I would say that as a rostered leader, you know that going into it.
Yes.
A
Yeah.
lay leader, they don't necessarily have that same drive per se. They may be very faithful. They may be very oriented towards whatever they're focused on, but there is a difference between what motivates you
Right.
in that role versus what sort of what is part of your active ministry.
Right.
I know we're nearing the end of our time for this episode, but I'd like us to linger a bit. We have not explicitly addressed that word call. We've used it in these conversations, but I often hear people, and just as recently as the other week, one of the people here in the congregation, very active leader, saying, I never quite understand what is meant. And for us who are closer to this work and that habit of language, we can begin to use it almost as jargon.
Yeah.
And I think it's confusing for a lot of people because I suspect they think we're describing some sort of ethereal,
Yeah.
Moses on the mountain. and the
Jesus'
burning
baptism,
bush.
right? Like the clouds open.
I think of it very specifically and tangibly. And it has to do with why I dress this way. While this is common for Lutheran pastors in the United States, it's neither required nor universal. I dress this way when I am doing anything related to my call, and I'll say something about that, because it holds me accountable in my own mind. I'm choosing not to be, and I appreciate what you said, Megan.
Yeah.
I'm choosing not to be anonymous.
Right.
That holds me accountable, and I understand the call very much to be, while it's bigger than this, it is the call of this congregation and its people. The call of this people to me to say, serve in this role as our pastor. And we understand as Lutherans and share this with Episcopalians that the church is larger than a particular local congregation, but it's not smaller than that. And each of us, in the language of ELCA rostering, we have particular calls. And I very much enter each day thinking of the people of Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick and their call to me to be, to serve, to live, to become their pastor.
I think there's some reassurance, I think, to that, because you've just described that there are two different ways, even how we outwardly show, how we as the, in the process have done this, but that's still authentic. Because when we're
Right.
calling that, like,
Yeah.
okay, why do you do blank? We as, and I'm sure hearing this in the committee process, we should be able to articulate that. And I think in the growing process and in the formation process, I think one important aspect is to speak on this, to say, okay, have you thought about how you view this? Because I think that's also, I think, a pretty practical understanding. And I really respect how you described it, because I feel like you've had genuine thought about it. This is something about who you are, not only as a person, but as a called clergy, as someone who's called to this congregation. And just, I think that's, I just wanted to sort of lift that up to say, in discernment, in call, I think that's what, I think a tangible example of what we mean by authentic, to say it's not just, well, because I look better in black, or because I like the color.
It hides the coffee stains.
It hides the coffee stain, or whatever. or I'm, in this aspect, I'm not going to wear the collar because it's more important to be in and among. And I think that's those kinds of conversations, at least for me, and others can jump in. I think that's the kind of intentionality that I think one who is being formed should have. That just really purposeful, I think.
And I would say that the committee will often reinforce that conversation as to what people are using as their call story and how that changes and evolves over the course of their education, their seminary education. Because many people or not many people, it's not uncommon for you to not be sure about what your call is.
Yeah.
Right.
And part of our role as a committee is to help people sort of chisel that out
Yeah.
and challenge that a little bit, and maybe suggest that they do certain things to explore that a little bit. You know, the term call and discernment sort of run very,
Yeah.
very interchangeably. And the other big aspect is vocation as opposed to job. There is a big difference between call and job.
Right.
And I find that to be one of the biggest things that get confused in the lay arena, because they look often as this is a job. It's like it's not.
Yeah.
It's more than that.
Right.
Well, on that note, I think that's a suitable place for us to let your words settle within us. Again, thank you so much, Bob,
You're very
for
welcome.
bringing
It's been
your
fun.
commitment and your experience and your insight. I'm Paul Baglios.
I'm Daniel Catalano.
Bob Hahn.
And Megan Wyant.
We'll see you next time.
This has been Two Pews in a Pod, a podcast hosted by the lead pastor of Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.